Hello, everyone. Happy Nowruz, and thank you for joining us at the National Council of Resistance of Iran, U.S. Representative Office. My name is Alireza Jafarzadeh, and I'm the Deputy Director of the NCRI's Washington office. We're delighted to host this event coinciding with the Iranian New Year, Nowruz. And of course, because we have to hold this event online, we have to do it minus the Persian food, the pastry, and the nuts, and of course, without the live music. And the most you will get is to take a look at the half-scene table right next to me. And actually, the half-scene table is a tradition that comes with the Iranian New Year. The special table includes 7 symbols that represent life, all starting with the letter S. And for instance, sabze, which is wheat sprout, represents rebirth. Sip, which is apple, represents beauty. And serke, which is vinegar, represents patience. Seer, which is garlic, represents health. Samanu, which is wheat germ pudding, represents strength and power. Senjet, which is oyster, represents love. And somak represents sunrise. And that's what we are looking for, the sunrise of freedom in the new Iranian year. Now, again, after thanking all of you for joining us, I want to briefly introduce our impressive and distinguished guest speakers today. And they are, I'm just going to mention their names, Senator Bob Torricelli, former Democratic Senator from New Jersey, Governor Tom Ridge, former Governor of Pennsylvania, and the first U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security. We'll have 4-star General retired Chuck Wald, former Deputy Commander of the United States European Command, Ambassador Bob Joseph, former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, Ambassador Mitchell Reese, former Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State. We'll have Ambassador Mark Ginsburg, the former ambassador to Morocco and former White House Middle East advisor for President Carter. We will also have Georgetown Professor Matthew Kronig, Director of the Global Strategy Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Also, Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield Jr. will be with us. He was the former Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. Mr. John Sano, former Deputy Director of the National Clandestine Service, will also be joining us. Dr. Stephen Bucci, visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. We'll have Professor Ivan Sasha Sheehan, Executive Director of the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Baltimore. And last but not least, Mr. Bruce McColm, President of Global Initiative for Democracy, former Executive Director of Freedom House. I want to thank all of our guest speakers joining us today for this Nowruz celebration, but also addressing some of the most pressing issues related to Iran. With that, let me introduce our first speaker, Ms. Suna Samsami, who is the U.S. representative of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. She's going to provide you with an update about the latest status of the Iranian regime. Ms. Samsami, please.
Distinguished speakers, dear friends, I'm delighted that you could join us today to celebrate the arrival of spring, which marks the Iranian New Year. Happy Nowruz to all of you. Nowruz means a new day. From all indications, domestically and internationally, it appears that the Iranian year 1400 will be different from all the previous years, and it will be the harbinger of the dawn of a new year in Iran, when freedom will dawn on our fettered homeland. Several factors account for such optimism. First, the religious dictatorship ruling Iran is engulfed in profound political, social, and economic crisis, unprecedented over the past 40 years. Rouhani's government is broken and crippled, owing to endemic and systematic corruption and mismanagement. The regime has failed to address the underlying economic and social grievances that led to major uprising in 2017, 2019, or 2020. More recently, the people in the impoverished province of Sistan and Baluchistan in the southeast of Iran rose up and challenged the regime's security and suppressive forces for several days. Second, the continuing protest by thousands of retirees, pensioners, as well as other sectors of Iranian society, who not only have to deal with the catastrophic impact of coronavirus pandemic that has claimed the lives of 250,000 Iranians, but also the spiraling prices of basic needs. With repression failing to stem the tide of uprising and protest, the mullahs had pinned their hopes and prayers to the 2020 US elections. But in the 2 months since the new US president in the United States has taken office, it has become clear that a return to the previous balance of power is impossible. Even the regime's supreme leader Khamenei had to acknowledge this fact that 2021 is not 2015. He lamented during his New Year message and again pleading for the removal of the crippling international sanctions before halting the severe violation of the fatally flawed Iran nuclear deal known as the JCPOA. These developments go to show whatever happens in the future, the outcome awaiting the regime would be the outbursts of uprising leading to its overthrow. Indeed, with the JCPOA or without it, with the sanctions or without it, the regime cannot escape the outbreak of uprising and its overthrow. This is particularly the case because last year, the Iranian resistance achieved remarkable progress, exemplified in an overwhelming desire by Iran's courageous youth to join the MEK resistance unit and in the spread of networks of its supporters in Iranian cities. The waves of arrest, instilling of terror and fear, ceaseless publications of books, movies, TV series, various publications against the MEK has failed to dent the younger generation's support for this movement. So let me conclude. I would like to emphasize a few points. The regime is now at its weakest point. The circumstances for a revolution are in place in Iran, and the social readiness for overthrowing the regime is beyond the shadow of any doubt. The position of the Iranian regime in 2021 is totally weaker than in 2015, but it wants to paint a completely different picture by threatening others. And my second point, in order to gain more concessions, the regime has tried to test the US government resolve by setting up rocket attacks in countries in the region and by further violating its nuclear commitments over the past few months. And number three, any concession to this regime or silence toward its crime will only embolden it to increase its threat more than ever before. The only option for the United States and for the international community is to show maximum resolve against this regime and to stand on the side of the Iranian people as they strive to bring down the regime and establish a democratic, secular, non-nuclear republic in Iran. Thank you all for joining us today, and happy Nowruz again to everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Ms. Samsami. You certainly provided lots of reasons for optimism in this new Iranian year. We're now going to have the opportunity to hear from a longtime friend of the Iranian resistance, someone who has followed the Iranian developments for the past 4 decades, to say the least, former senator from New Jersey, Bob Torricelli, who, by the way, joined the Democratic leadership in his very first term in the United States Senate. Senator Torricelli, great to have you. Please.
Alireza, thank you so much for having me today. To you, to Mrs. Rajavi, to people in the movement and your guests today, a happy Nowruz. May you all have a happy, prosperous, peaceful, but mostly successful new year in the long struggle for Iranian freedom. In this season of spring and new life, what is remarkable, I think, to all of us is that the seeds of discord and change have been planted throughout Iran. The thousands of people who have taken to the streets, the protests, the slogans, those who have put their lives at risk. Indeed, 1,500 souls have lost their lives in this new, perhaps last chapter in the fight for Iranian freedom. So on this Nowruz, we'll remember them, those who were lost in the last year, and we'll remark in the courage as a new year starts of those who have taken a stand to salvage and change their country. A new administration in America raises the issue of where we go from here in Iranian-American relations. And let me begin both by a statement of admiration and frankly some of relief with the comments of Secretary of State Blinken, who has made clear, lest it not be understood in Tehran, that there will be no change, no reconciliation, no unilateral concessions until the Iranians act. If there's any belief in Tehran that the deterioration of Iranian behavior in the last year, from testing ballistic missiles to attacks on American troops to increasing levels of purification, were going to be overlooked or ignored, or that sanctions would be removed and relations improved despite this behavior, he has made clear that isn't going to happen. I could not agree more, but still bears repeating that we all understand in the new administration and indeed throughout the United States government on a bipartisan basis, that the Iran of 2021 is not the Iran of 2015 and 16. There have been fundamental changes. And as we say, the genie cannot be put back in the bottle. Continuing armaments of Iran with new, powerful, and accurate ballistic missiles that give not only their conventional forces, but their potential nuclear forces a new lethal threat. Continuation and rise in terrorist activities. The support of activities of despotic regimes in Syria, the rebels in Yemen, and throughout the world. The continued deterioration in security in Iraq and attacks on American forces. And perhaps most importantly, the breaking through of thresholds for purification of nuclear materials. They not only cannot be ignored, they can't be changed. The clock can't be rolled back. And so any mention of rejoining the JCPOA begins with how do we respond? How do we change policies? But on the contrary, what is it the Iranians do to change these variables that are so fundamentally different than only 4 years ago? As we face different facts on the ground on security, there's also one other enormous factor for American policy. The thousands of people who have put their lives at risk, been jailed, tortured, taken to the streets and taken a stand. For those of us who've been involved in American policy long enough, there are a few moments of which we are not proud. The encouraging of protesters to take to the streets of Czechoslovakia in 1968, only to see them crushed with no Western response. The Shia and Kurdish forces who took to the streets against Saddam Hussein after the Persian Gulf War, only to see them crushed with no Western response. This is to be remembered, lest now the people of Iran who have taken advantage of the apparent resolve of the United States to take to the streets, to support sanctions against their own country to weaken the regime, if they have acted at their own risk, and now we were to abandon them by reconciliation with a despotic regime, history must not repeat itself. The United States is on the right course. I know deep in the heart of every American, we sometimes naively believe that there is good in everyone if you wait long enough and try hard enough to find it. History has taught us that is not always true. It is not true here. There is no reconciliation with the mullahs. There is no good and decent heart beating in their chests. Sometimes evil is just what it appears to be, evil. The only answer for the regime in Tehran is that it comes to an end, and the people of Iran reclaim their country and get the kind of free and prosperous and secure future that have been shared by people around the globe. It is time to end the fact that Iran is an exception to the prosperity and freedom that is engulfing the planet. For our part as Americans, our role is simple. Stay the course, keep to our principles, allow the Iranian people the space and the time to reclaim their country. To everyone in Iran who may hear our voices today, happy Nowruz. We wish you the best, most successful, hopefully the freest of New Years. You deserve a new future. You'll get it. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Senator Torricelli. Your very uplifting message and remarks. You reminded everyone that it's about the evil nature of this regime, and that despite all the horrible acts of the regime, the people have continued their struggle. Your recommendations to the Biden administration to basically what you said, stay the course, stick to the principles, and basically allow the people of Iran the time and space to do what they need to do, which is ending the rule of the Ayatollahs and bringing freedom and democracy to Iran. Thank you so much for that. We're now going to hear from Honorable Tom Ridge, the first Secretary of Homeland Security and former Governor of Pennsylvania. Governor, you mentioned earlier when we were talking that you really want to spend your time today to sending a message to what we call the freedom fighters in Ashraf 3 in Albania. You said that the best message that Washington has to get is to hear the story of those who are fighting for freedom in Iran. So, Governor, I would love to hear that. Please. You're on, Governor.
Nowruz Mubarak. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to celebrate this very special day with you and to send not only my best wishes, but also my deepest admiration and respect for your sustained and unwavering commitment to the cause of liberty and freedom in Iran. I think coming on 15 years now. I remember those early days in Ashraf 1 and Ashraf 2. I remember how you persevered through those challenging, blood-stained years and times in Iraq, and how you held your ground, relentless to the core, in spite of the obstacles thrown in your way by Iraq, Iran, and occasionally even sometimes from the United Nations. And in spite of it all, in spite of every single obstacle, you never gave up. There's perseverance, and this is perseverance in the face of unfathomable obstacles. Was and remains a source of inspiration for all your American friends and colleagues. And I think it's important to note, as you held your ground against tyranny, terrorism, and oppression, you began to attract more and more supporters from around the globe, as evidenced by the number of countries that are represented historically on our annual event that we've been holding in Paris for long over a decade. Now in Ashraf 3, I know you are more determined than ever to bring about a democratic, non-nuclear, free, and secular Iran. You've begun this journey years and years ago, decades ago, actually, if you think about it. And with your spirit and resolve remains untarnished. You have been relentless in your pursuit, and your daily lives, your historic resistance, and your decades-long sacrifice, I'm quite confident, is indeed great inspiration to your leader, Madam Rajavi, great inspiration to young Iranians from around the world who support your cause, who understand and appreciate the sacrifice you've made on their behalf. So on this very special day, on this happy occasion, I commend and salute you. This day of new beginnings, year 1400, on this Nowruz, I am honored, and truly honored, and privileged to have had the opportunity to work with all of you in support of this noble and worthy cause, freedom for the people in Iran. And on this particular day, may you, your colleagues in Ashraf, your friends and family in Iran, and around the globe for that matter, look to this year to provide much happiness, good health, and one step closer to freedom and liberty for the people of Iran. Thank you. It's wonderful to join you. Have a grand and glorious day.
Thank you, Governor Ridge. Really appreciate that. In fact, it is our honor and privilege to have someone like yourself standing on the side of the people of Iran. And as you said, we look to this year to provide much happiness, good health, one step closer to freedom, as you said, to freedom and liberty, you said, and for the people of Iran. And that day of liberty will certainly come soon. Appreciate that again. And I want to remind everyone that we have so many other Iranian Americans joining us live and watching this event on Zoom all over the country. I want to thank every one of them who've joined us, and certainly they have a lot to be very hopeful for the future of Iran. We're now going to hear from General Chuck Wald. He's a former deputy commander of U.S. European Command. He has an impeccable military career, including commanding the 9th Air Force and U.S. Central Command Air Force and Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina. General Wald, would like to hear your thoughts on the Iran regime's threats and the way to deal with it, or whatever you have on your mind. General, please.
Alireza, thank you and your team for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to see you. First, I want to pass on my best wishes to the National Council of Resistance of Iran for a happy Nowruz, a happy New Year. It's an important event. And we're proud of all of you and all of your colleagues around the world, especially in Albania. Alireza asked me to talk a little bit about the current situation with Iran, specifically with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iranian nuclear deal that the United States signed in 2015 under President Obama, and where that stands today. Number one, I think the JCPOA, as it was originally signed, had some very significant flaws in it initially. I think the idea was good, but it allowed Iran, as all of you know, to circumvent some of the efforts that the plan had tried to put into place to keep Iran from developing not Iran per se, but the Iranian Ayatollah and his mullahs were trying to put into place to develop a nuclear weapon. That worked okay, although again, there were some serious flaws in the plan initially. One being the inspection regime was weak. There's very easy, as you all know better than anybody, Iran is a huge country. The Iranian people are very industrious, smart. And even though the IRGC is not exactly who we like, they do have smart people in the IRGC and the Ayatollahs. And they have figured out a way to work around the sanctions and the agreement to continue to develop surreptitiously nuclear capability, fissile material that could be then developed into a nuclear weapon, which would be a horrendously dangerous situation for not just the Middle East, but the whole world for that matter. As you all know, President Trump backed out of the JCPOA for various reasons, some of which I just stated, along with the fact that Iran continues to build significant ballistic missile capability and other fissile material that's now being purified to the level that could be used in a nuclear weapon, which is exceedingly dangerous for both the Middle East and the rest of the world. Along with that, as you know, again, preaching to the choir, as they say in the United States, Iran continues to be a malicious enemy of the United States in the Middle East from the standpoint of attacking our people, attacking our bases, supporting other people around the region that are working against the United States, putting our people at risk and sometimes killing them. They're also supporting the Houthis in Yemen against the Saudi Arabia government and the rest of the Middle East there. As a matter of fact, the Houthis, for those that follow this, but for those that don't know, have fired over 800 rockets and UAVs into the Saudi Arabian landmass all over Riyadh, Jeddah, other cities over the last 2 years, 800. So they continue to do that. They continue to promote terrorism. They continue to support organizations that are terrorist organizations and against the West and against your organization. And that has not stopped and won't stop unless there is some serious activity that hinders the Ayatollahs to maintain their stronghold over the population of Iran, people like yourselves. The sanctions have hurt Iran a lot. The fact that they can't sell oil at will around the world. But again, the discussion today in the Biden administration, which I'm not political in any way, I'm a neutral independent. But I think that the fact that it's being addressed is important. I think the fact, though, that unless there is a really strong, capable, able inspection regime put in place under whatever agreement comes to place, if it's a new JCPOA 2 or if it's another agreement, which probably would be a good idea. But they need to be able to, the inspectors around the world, the UN inspectors, the IAEA, needs to be able to get into Iran at will, unannounced, and inspect. The Iranians need to stop. The IRGC needs to stop building and testing ballistic missiles that could reach not just the Middle East, but Europe and potentially the United States at some point. They need to stop sponsoring the attack of Western military personnel that are trying to stabilize the region in Iraq and other places around the area. And then, most importantly, they need to start treating their people with respect and give the people of Iran, people like yourselves, the groups that are looking to have Iran take a place in the world where they belong as one of the great civilizations and people in the world. And if that happens, that will be good for all. But we can't be blind to the fact that the Iranian government, as it is today, will try to take advantage of the situation. They sometimes, I'd say almost always, don't negotiate with goodwill. And so we have to be strong in that respect. So that's how I feel about it. I do want to commend the NCRIC NCRI, I should say, for all the super work you're doing for your people, for the people of Iran that are free, love freedom, want to be part of the Western world or the rest of the world per se, as a contributing set of a civilization for that matter. One of the first things I did when I was in the Air Force was after Vietnam was I was an instructor pilot. And one of my first students, matter of fact, my first student as an instructor pilot was an Iranian named Mahmoud Kazemi, one of the best guys I've ever met. Really outstanding pilot. And I can tell you from personal experience, I know the talent your people have and how important it would be for you to be in charge of that great country. So thank you and Happy New Year.
Thank you so much, General Walt. You certainly had a very comprehensive look at the developments regarding Iran, especially the nature of the regime on their nuclear side and other things. I'm sure there are a lot of people who would be very receptive to your thoughts, your ideas, both in the administration, but also on Capitol Hill in the US Congress. You know, there's a lot of interest in the US Congress to see how, if there is an agreement, how that new agreement should look like and what it should include, including people from both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. So your thoughts are certainly going to be very welcome, and appreciate your support for the people of Iran and for the Iranian resistance, as you said. Now I would like to now go to Ambassador Robert Joseph, who was formerly the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, and he was also a special envoy for non-proliferation. He also served in the National Security Council as a special assistant to the president and senior director for proliferation strategy, counter-proliferation, and homeland defense. Earlier, he was principal deputy secretary of defense for international security policy. Ambassador Joseph, thank you for joining us, and we're very interested to hear your thoughts. Please.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to join this event. Let me first join with the other speakers in wishing all of our NCRI and MEK colleagues a very happy Nowruz. My very best to all of you, whether you're here in the United States, you're in Paris or across Europe, of course, the residents of Ashraf 3, and especially the freedom fighters inside Iran who seek the overthrow of this evil regime. As Alireza noted, the symbols of this holiday are also the symbols of the fight for freedom and justice. With Nowruz comes the spring and the rebirth of nature. With the victory over the religious dictatorship, the great Persian nation will be reborn, leaving the darkness of winter and ushering in the light that is essential for the people of Iran to live in peace and prosperity, to live in a society that celebrates the rights of all people, to live freely and to possess the basic human rights that are essential to the fabric of any civilized nation. At the start of a new year, whether it's the first day of January or the first day of spring, it's customary to look backward and to look forward. Looking backward on the main issues associated with US policy on Iran, I would ask, what are the key lessons? And I would mention three. First, appeasement of the regime in any and every form has failed to achieve US objectives. The pattern is clear. The mullahs pocket each concession and then demand more. The notion that the regime will reform, will become more moderate, or will abandon its malign behavior is a false notion. The regime can't reform. The regime can't change. It can only survive through repression and brutality, which has been a consistent characteristic of the regime for 42 years. Second, the regime will never give up its quest for nuclear weapons. It may take some tactical maneuvers, as it did with the JCPOA, but it will continue to advance its capability to have a nuclear weapon at the time of its choosing. Just look at the actions that have been taken in the past 18 months. Violating the JCPOA limits on the amount of LEU retained in country, increasing the level of enrichment, going operational with advanced centrifuges, preparing to produce uranium metal, which has only one purpose, and that is for a nuclear weapon, as well as other measures that the regime has taken. And together, these actions show the failure of the agreement to block Iran's pathway to a nuclear weapon, which, as I think you will all recall, was one of the principal selling points of the Obama administration. And these actions are the ones that are being taken in the open. Just imagine what else is being done where the inspectors are not allowed. And third, abandoning the principled policy of promoting human rights, as was done in 2009, only encourages more gross violations. Moreover, silence in the face of mass executions and torture represents an abandonment of our own values and is an encouragement to dictators everywhere. So how do we apply these lessons as we look forward? First, only by showing strength and exerting pressure will the regime back down. Concessions will be seen as weakness and will only bring more egregious behavior at home against the people of Iran and abroad through the regime's continuing acts of state terrorism, its support for terrorist proxies, and its foreign aggression. Second, rejoining the JCPOA will only bring what the agreement brought in 2015. Billions of dollars for the regime to squander in its support for the Assad's war against the Syrian people, its support for the Houthis in Yemen, its support for terrorist organizations such as Hezbollah, and of course, money to fill the pockets of the corrupt regime leadership. And in return, there will be no real constraints on Iran's behavior or its ability to break out to acquire a nuclear weapon. We've seen the movie before. We know the outcome, and we know that the second time around won't be any different. And as for the talking point that rejoining the JCPOA will be only the first step to a broader agreement to constrain Iran's malign behavior, how gullible do you think we are? Rejoining the JCPOA would be the last step, not the first step. The mullahs would have everything they want, especially relief from the crushing economic sanctions. And the Supreme Leader has made clear that missiles and foreign aggression and support for terrorist proxies are not on the negotiating table, as he did before. And there is no reason to believe that they are on the table now. Every reason to believe that they are not. Third, and I'll be very brief, the means to success in achieving US objectives in the nuclear, regional stability, and counterterrorism areas is through regime change. Regime change not through military invasion, but by supporting the democratic opposition. This is a regime that has lost all legitimacy with the people. It is an evil regime that has committed documented crimes against humanity. It is a brittle regime that should and will be overthrown by the Iranian people. At a minimum, we must not stand in their way. We must not feed the beast. We must support the people of Iran, not their dictators. Thank you for the invitation to join you today. And again, happy Nowruz.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think you summed it up at the very end. We must support the Iranian people, not the dictators. And you certainly were right in saying all the mullahs really want is to go back to what it was, the 2015 JCPOA, and get the sanctions lifted, and then don't allow anyone to bother with any other aspects of the regime. And you correctly said that the real solution, the lasting solution, is regime change. by the people of Iran. Really appreciate that, Ambassador. We're now going to hear from Ambassador Mark Ginsburg. Mr. Ginsburg was appointed by President Clinton, and he served for 4 years in Morocco as U.S. ambassador. Ambassador Ginsburg commenced his government career as a national security legislative assistant to late Senator Edward Kennedy. And during the Carter administration, Ambassador Ginsburg was appointed Deputy Senior Advisor to President Carter Middle East policy in the White House. He later served as an advisor to President Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign and for Vice President Al Gore's 2000 presidential campaign. Ambassador Ginsburg, welcome to the event today, and I think the Biden administration would be interested to hear your thoughts.
Well, Alireza, thank you, and thanks to all of my colleagues. And in this year of 1400, may this be a year of blessing to all of the people of Iran, as well as to all of my friends in the Iranian community in the diaspora here in the United States and around the world. May it be a particularly sweet year. I wanted to focus on what is taking place inside Iran, the struggle for democracy, the struggle for freedom that we know has brought Iranian people to the streets and at times sacrificed their lives. There's such utter contempt for the widespread financial corruption, the cronyism and nepotism that has to be viewed as key contributing factors to the enormous number of protests that had taken place than what is the period what is known as Bloody November. That is this period between 2019 and 2020, where so many Iranians took to the streets, tens of thousands, to protest the corrupt regime of the Ayatollahs. These protests essentially led so many Iranians to ask themselves, are we living in a regime that is no different than the corrupt regimes of the past? The financial corruption at the top of the Ayatollah's regime and across almost every segment of his regime cries out for an overturning of the regime and an end to the corruption. You know, for example, President Rouhani's brother, Hussein Khaireddin, he was formerly in charge of the security apparatus of the Ayatollah, and he was recently caught in a major bribery and financial scheme. The list goes on of Iranian officials who are taking bribes, who are taking kickbacks, who are stealing vaccines, who are making it impossible for the Iranian people to benefit from any economic benefit that they are entitled to. If there ever was a kleptocracy that exists in the Middle East, it is the Iranian regime that, by all accounts, is viewed as one of the most corrupt regimes by any measure and an index around the world. You know, when the people of Iran took to the streets, it represented really a watershed moment in the Iranian people's hope and determination to end the industrial scale corruption of the Ayatollah. We have to think about that in 21 cities, Iranians risked their lives to protest an end to the regime and an end to the hardship that the regime has imposed on them. They rose courageously, demanding democracy, the rule of law, all of the things that Madame Rajavi's important points of a democratic society that she's unveiled and shared with the Iranian people in the past. These severe and widespread protests continue to this day against a money-grubbing Ayatollah whose own office willingly grants tax havens to organizations of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that kicks back money back into the Ayatollah's private bank accounts. What Iranian in their right mind would want to continue a regime that is so corrupt at the highest levels? Why wouldn't the Iranian people demand justice and an end to corruption when the Ayatollah grants these exemptions to businesses across the regime that are denying the Iranian people an economy that is free and fair for them to be able to benefit from. Why wouldn't, I ask, the Iranian people demand justice when they learn that the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is really the Iranian equivalent of the Gestapo, controls 60% of the economy and the scarce COVID vaccines while the Iranian people suffer? The Iranian people took to the streets and they chanted death to the liar. They were referring to the Ayatollah and to his decrepit regime. When there was a regime cover-up of the horrific downing of the Ukrainian airline last year, once again, this regime did everything possible to deny the Iranian people the truth. I want to say something that I think all of us share, that the Iranian people, by temperament and by their affinity for the West, they are a people seeking democracy and democratic values. You know, the American people have to distinguish between the corrupt regime of the Ayatollah and the Iranian people who seek democracy and democratic freedom. Madame Rajavi and the many thousands of people who are supporting her in Albania, and the tens of thousands who are supporting her around the world, and the hundreds of thousands who are supporting her efforts inside Iran, is a beacon of light to those Iranians who look forward to a better year. You know, the values that are offered by her leadership and the determination by her countrymen to free themselves from the grip of this dictatorship cannot be anything but embraced by the American people. You know, when we think about the Nowruz holiday, it really is the day of the coming of the light. It is to rid the country of the dirt and darkness and read to the trash bin of history the Ayatollah's regime. So when we think about this Nowruz holiday, we think about the fact that this is indeed the potential year for the coming of the light, a light that shines brightly on democratic freedoms and on the efforts of all of us who aspire for Iran's better day, a better day of freedom, hope, and liberty. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. I wish all of my Iranian friends the most joyous of holidays, and as we say, next year in Tehran. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ginsburg. Better days certainly are ahead of us. You, I think, made it very clear that we're talking about the corrupt regime, and you looked at both factions, the Khamenei faction and Rouhani faction, how they are involved in plundering the wealth of a nation and showing that these are not people to deal with. The real representatives of the people of Iran are actually those who are standing up against the Ayatollahs and who are fighting them. Appreciate that, and appreciate the Nowruz wishes for the people of Iran. With that, after Ambassador Ginsburg, I want to go to Ambassador Mitchell Reese, former director of the policy planning at the U.S. Department of State. He was also U.S. Special Envoy for Northern Ireland. He was also the 8th president and CEO of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and the 27th president of the Washington College. Ambassador Reese, great to have you with us. Please share your thoughts. You're on.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you again. Let me first wish a very happy Nowruz to each of you and your family and friends. I hope this new year finds you safe and well. Thank you for allowing me a few minutes to share with you my views on the situation in Iran, in the region, and in the United States with the new Biden administration. As I look at the situation inside Iran, I see a government that has lost all legitimacy in the eyes of its own people. I see a government that is grossly incompetent in running Iran. We've known for years that the mullahs and the IRGC are more interested in maintaining their grip on power than in serving the people. They have mishandled the outbreak of the COVID virus, resulting in the deaths of more than 225,000 Iranians, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, aunts and uncles, all across the country. These victims are the result of the government's inability to meet the fundamental responsibility of every government, which is to protect and safeguard the health of its citizens. Tehran has failed this basic test. We've also seen the government's incompetence in managing the economy, rising food prices, spiraling gas prices, inflation, the lack of jobs. All of these are indications of a regime that does not understand how to run a modern economy. The mullahs in the IRGC understand violence. They understand how to maintain themselves in power. They understand how to rob and steal. They understand that they cannot allow free speech or fair and free elections, but they are completely incompetent to do anything else. One reason for this incompetence is that the regime spends far more time and far more money intervening in other countries, such as Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Gaza, and Lebanon. Instead of listening to the voices of the Iranian people, the mullahs in the IRGC are far more interested in destabilizing the neighborhood. Instead of serving the Iranian people, the highest priority of the mullahs in the IRGC is bringing death and destruction to other parts of the world. We saw this recently with the unprecedented terrorism trial in Brussels, where a so-called Iranian diplomat and his accomplices were convicted in engaging in a terrorist act against the annual meeting of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. And let's not forget the series of threats that Iran issued before the trial, that there would be dire consequences, more terrorist acts in Europe if the defendants were actually convicted. The true nature of the regime in Tehran was revealed once again, and this time for all of Europe to see. Everyone needs to understand that this was not a rogue operation. This was not some unauthorized mission. It was characteristic of the violent and unlawful nature of the mullahs and the IRGC. And we've seen this type of reckless behavior before, with the tragic shooting down of the Ukrainian civilian airliner in January 2020. On this occasion, the mullahs and the IRGC were guilty of criminal incompetence, on display this time for the whole world to see. This continuing misrule by the mullahs and IRGC has had important consequences. First, the Iranian people have shown that the regime in Tehran has no popular support, no credibility. The Iranian people have shown that they do not believe that the mullahs and IRGC can ever change, adapt, or moderate their behavior. The Iranian people have concluded that popular opposition is the only way to complain about the regime and express their views for a better future. Inside Iran, we have seen brave and courageous people repeatedly demonstrate against the regime in cities, towns, and villages all across the country. They are calling for a life with dignity, where their human rights are respected, where they do not have to fear a knock on the door in the middle of the night, or routine corruption, or arbitrary justice. They simply want a country where they can vote for representatives who will listen and be responsive to their wishes for a better future for themselves and their children. Second, there is a new president now in Washington, D.C. Many of the officials who are serving in the Biden administration had served previously in the Obama administration, including those who negotiated the joint nuclear deal with Iran in 2015. Perhaps the mullahs and the IRGC hope that the United States will once more engage as before and sign new agreements that will enrich them and solidify their hold on power. If that is their hope, I think they are gravely mistaken. President Biden and his senior officials have all recognized the shortcomings of the 2015 nuclear agreement. They've admitted that the agreement did not address the ballistic missiles that Iran continues to develop. They've admitted that the agreement did not halt Iran's ongoing interference in the region. They've admitted that the agreement did nothing to halt the massive human rights violations that the mullahs and IRGC inflict every day on the Iranian people. In fact, support for human rights is quickly becoming a major theme of the Biden administration's overall approach to foreign policy. This is not good news for the mullahs and the IRGC. And although there is a good deal of partisan politics in Washington these days, the mullahs and IRGC also need to know that on this issue, on the threat that Iran poses to its own people, to the region, and to the United States, on this issue, there is broad bipartisan agreement between Republicans and Democrats. Congress may not be united on many issues, but it is united in its opposition to the regime in Tehran. This, too, is not good news for the mullahs and the IRGC. On this celebration of a new year, I am hopeful that the brave and long-suffering people of Iran will soon be able to enjoy the full blessings of freedom and peace. I wish you all a very happy and healthy new year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Rees, for reminding the Ayatollahs that they're gravely mistaken, that things are not going their way. And indeed, the brave and long-suffering people of Iran will soon be able to enjoy the blessing of peace and freedom, as you just mentioned. Now I'm delighted that we have a music piece performed by renowned Iranian composer, Mohammad Shams. Mr. Shams has composed more than 650 pieces of traditional, classical, and modern music. And in exile, he has found ways to introduce classical Persian music in international events, such as the London Festival in England. He has performed this piece for the occasion of Nowruz. So let's hear this. That was certainly a beautiful piece by Mr. Shams. We're now going to Georgetown University professor Matthew Kronig. the author or editor of 7 books. Dr. Kronig is the director of Global Strategy Initiative and deputy director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. He has served in several positions in the U.S. Department of Defense and the intelligence community in the Bush, the Obama, and the Trump administration, including on Iran policy. Professor Kronig, I know we are short on time. You have to run to your next meeting, and thank you for coming, and please share your thoughts with us.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Alireza, and thank you very much for the important work that you and your organization do. And Happy New Year, Happy Nowruz to you and the others gathered here today. The issue I wanted to discuss is one of the major themes of Biden's foreign policy, which is democracy versus autocracy. And Biden and his team have said that the threat the United States and its allies face comes principally from revisionist autocratic powers like Russia and China, and that to counter this, the United States wants to rally democracies against this threat. And I think that's the right assessment. And in fact, I wrote a book last year called The Return of Great Power Rivalry, Democracy versus Autocracy, from the Ancient World to the US and China. So I would just hope that as the Biden administration thinks about these autocratic challenges in Europe and Asia, it also appreciates the autocratic challenge in the Middle East. And the primary one comes from the mullahs in Tehran against US and allied interests. And so as it counters Russia and Europe, counters China and Asia, it needs to do the same against the clerics in Tehran. This isn't the kind of the regime that they should be trying to make deals with or make concessions to. Rather, we need a hardline approach, like they've already shown they're capable of with China in Alaska last week. And one of the themes of my book is that democracy is really the best machine ever invented for generating wealth and prosperity and freedom and happiness for people. And it's a shame that the people of Iran have been denied the blessings of democracy over the past several decades. But I hope that in the future, democracy will come to Iran. So I think I'll end my remarks there, but thank you very much for having me, and Happy New Year.
Thank you, Professor Kronig, for your very concise, sharp, and thoughtful remarks. You said blessings of democracy is really the key. Really appreciate your participation. We're now going to actually to another university professor, Professor Ivan Sasha Sheehan, who is the executive director of the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Baltimore. He has authored several books, taught at several universities, and some of his work, including the outcome of his research on the Iranian opposition and how Tehran deals with them, has already been published by the University of Baltimore and other publishers. Professor Sheehan, thank you so much for joining us. Please.
Well, thank you, Alireza, for the generous invitation to join you today and for hosting this important symposium. What a privilege it is to hear from such a distinguished group of bipartisan former US officials and policy experts, and to follow Professor Kronig of Georgetown University today. Today we celebrate the joyous occasion of the Iranian New Year. As some of you know, it's become a tradition in the Shian household to make the annual pilgrimage to Washington to join my Persian friends to celebrate Nowruz. My wife and small children look forward to the celebration, and though I'm disappointed the pandemic is keeping us apart this year, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to gather again soon. Today's event provides us an occasion to celebrate this new day, but also to take stock and to look forward. Since I have just a few minutes with you today, allow me to make a few key observations that are integral to upholding US security interests and maintaining an effective Iran policy. In the year ahead, US policy on Iran must prioritize the people of Iran and their relentless quest for freedom. For too long, US officials have treated the authoritarian regime in Tehran as a fixture of the Middle East landscape, and overestimated the use of negotiation as a tool for ensuring Iran's compliance with international norms and the regime's belligerence. In recent years, State Department efforts to champion the voices of protesters in Iran have emboldened the country's domestic population and its expatriate community by unleashing pro-democracy forces. But now US officials must remain committed to facilitating conditions that weaken the regime through external pressure. This is no time to return to a defensive posture on Iran. Iran's human rights record should be the principal focus of US policy in the year ahead. Naming and shaming those involved in arrests and torture and execution, including the regime's political, judicial, and security officials, is necessary to prevent further violence, including the execution of dissidents who continue to constitute the most credible architects of change in Tehran. This is particularly true when it comes to upholding or to holding regime officials accountable for crackdowns on protesters for engaging in peaceful demonstrations against the ruling theocracy. The continued enforcement and full implementation of all sanctions designed to target regime officials, entities, and regional networks is also imperative to ensure Iranian compliance with international laws and maintain US national security interests. This will require sustained and deliberate attention by the Biden White House in the year ahead. And finally, discredited talking points espoused by Tehran's well-organized Washington lobby and attacks on pro-democracy dissidents that undermine US officials' ability to access critical information need to be seen for what they are, and that is discredited. We know that Iran's theocratic leaders have a decades-long history of using both overt and covert tactics to undermine US interests, expand the regime's violent arc of influence, and export fundamentalism. We must continue to remind the Biden administration that far from engaging a good faith partner, the US in fact faces a hostile regime in Iran bent on the pursuit of conventional and unconventional weapons, committed to instability operations that undermine
criticism
US security, engaged in continued suppression of pro-democracy demonstrations, and intent on subverting the opposition to clerical rule at all costs. Since the nuclear issue is likely to also be a focus for US officials in the months ahead, allow me to offer just a few brief observations on this matter as well. With Iran exceeding limits on its nuclear pursuits imposed under the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and the regime's foreign minister taking a hardline stance by rejecting President Biden's terms for reviving negotiations with the regime on the nuclear issue, it is increasingly difficult to see how the White House will find a conciliatory path forward on Iran without abandoning US and global security interests. Simply put, Tehran is in no position to dictate the terms of future engagement on the nuclear issue. In fact, the US is in a strong position to drive a hard bargain with the regime by insisting that they cease terror operations abroad, dismantle the regime's ballistic missile program, stop meddling in the affairs of countries in the region, improve their human rights record, and disclose their clandestine nuclear pursuits. US officials are therefore wise to maintain and expand assertive policies aimed at exploiting Iran's increasingly apparent vulnerabilities and seeking to further curtail the regime's nefarious activities. If US officials prioritize the Iranian people, and not only their leaders, emphasize human rights, enforce sanctions imposed on the regime, and support Iran's pro-democracy activists by bypassing the Iran lobby, I am confident that US security interests will be served, the aspirations of the Iranian people will be upheld, and Iran can once again become a cradle of freedom in the Middle East. Thank you again for the opportunity to join you today. I wish all of you a very happy Nowruz.
Thank you so much, Professor Shehan. You certainly, I'm very much hoping, as you said, that next year, if not in a free Iran, definitely we'll have an opportunity to have the Nowruz event in person. You talked about the fact that the administration, everybody need to understand that the regime, Tehran, is weak, and that they need to prioritize the Iranian people over the ruthless rulers of Iran. You also highlighted about the Washington lobby for the Iranian regime. And by the way, you played a big role in exposing them, putting out articles, publications about that lobby, the kind of disinformation that they spread. Actually, one of your colleagues who worked closely with you in putting out a lot of books and publications, including by the University of Baltimore, was Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield, who we're going to hear from, who was the former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. Ambassador Bloomfield, please.
Greetings to all my friends at the NCRI-US Washington office, to the Organization of Iranian American Communities, to the Iranian American community at large, and to all Iranian people around the world. I wish you a happy Nowruz. Every year at this time, we all express hope for better times, for freedom in Iran, for a better outcome for the Iranian people, and to a happy ending to the long struggle for freedom. This year, we have hope, but we also see evidence that things are moving in the right direction. We find governments, including the United States, speaking out about human rights and about repression and about destabilization and terrorism. We see a government in Damascus, which is in trouble now, being sanctioned for crimes against humanity. We see a government in Saudi Arabia, which is being criticized for the murder of a journalist who spoke out working in the United States. We see criticism of the military in Burma, who has suppressed democratic government, criticism of the Chinese government for taking away freedom of the people in Hong Kong, criticism of the Russian government for jailing a brave dissident, Alexei Navalny. Well, in Iran, every one of those crimes, the regime in Iran has done more than the other countries that are being criticized. Iran is the worst violator on terrorism, suppression of human rights, on murdering its dissidents and jailing brave defenders of democracy. They are a corrupt regime which is engaged in trafficking, in drugs, in persons, in children, in so many ways, undermining the hope for a rules-based international order. Unfortunately, as you all know too well, the jails of Iran are filled with Alexei Navalny's, and the unmarked graves filled with brave dissidents who just dared to speak their own mind about the future of their country are filled with the bodies of Iranian Jamal Khashoggis by the tens of thousands. So let us work together to alert the world to your story about your friends, your family members, your country. This time, I think governments are listening. They understand that you're telling the truth, and there's a lot more hope this time in Nowruz for a free Iran. So happy Nowruz. I look forward to seeing you all in person soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Bloomfield. You said to alert the world. You have certainly done a great work in doing that yourself with a lot of research activity you have done. Now I'd like to go to Mr. John Sano, the former Deputy Director of the National Clandestine Service. He spent 28 years in the intelligence community, and he was particularly focused on the operations of the Iranian regime's Ministry of Intelligence, known as the MOIS. So Mr. Sano, thank you for joining us, and we'd like to hear your thoughts, please.
Thank you, Alireza, and Happy New Year. First, I want to wish everyone a wonderful New Year, along with my fervent desire that before the next New Year, we'll be able to celebrate this properly in a free and a prosperous Iran. So your struggles have been many, and your sacrifices have been great, but it will all lead to an eventual revitalization, a rebirth of your country, a country that will be free from persecution, terror, and harassment. A failing economy, continuing repression of human rights, a persistently hostile attitude towards the international community, attacks against US facilities, not to mention Iran's growing violations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This clearly demonstrates the frustration that the regime is experiencing. And they brandish this frustration against their own people. So one only has to look at the most recent instances of persecution and terror that Iran's terrorist organization, the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, has perpetrated upon its own people, as well as those of other nations. The recent conviction of Iran's senior diplomat, Asadollah Assadi, on charges of terrorism, and having been sentenced to 20 years in prison along with 3 of his accomplices, that's just one indication of the lengths that Tehran will go to in order to maintain their fragile control over their own people. Through murder, kidnapping, torture. This is not how a democracy works. This is not what the people of Iran want or deserve. But the people of Iran have not been cowed by these threats and this inhumane treatment. Okay? Quite the contrary. The number of protests that have been growing over the past few years are beginning to take its toll. And despite the overly harsh retribution they have received, the taking of innocent lives, the protests and the discontent continues to rise. And the ruling mullahs are indeed worried. Though this threat remains, the people of Iran have continued to demonstrate their resolve and their determination to bring about real change in Iran. And that is what the mullahs are most afraid of, change, because change means the end of their dictatorial regime. The Ayatollah and the ruling mullahs see the advent of a new administration in Washington as an opportunity to take an advantage for their own good. Their escalation of violations of the nuclear deal, as well as other more overt acts of violence, are meant to pressure the new Biden administration into lifting sanctions and returning to the previous agreement back in 2015. But the US should never reward Tehran's continuously bad behavior, okay? Instead, it should hold Iran accountable for its violations of international agreements, its hostile actions towards the rest of the world, and above all, for its massive human rights violations against its own people. So your efforts, the efforts of Madam Rajavi and that of the entire MEK organization, are not just a beacon of hope for positive change, but it's an international example of how Iran could be, what the future should be, as an active participant in the international community, a force for freedom in a turbulent region, and for true democracy, and for equal representation. So in conclusion, again, I want to wish you all a joyous and a prosperous new year, and that we continue along the path to a free and truly democratic Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Sano. You talk about the rebirth of our country. You talked about accountability. And you said that this movement is not only a beacon of hope, but also an example for the future to see, for the world to know how Iran could actually look like and what role they can actually play. I appreciate that. So we're now going to hear from Dr. Stephen Bucci, visiting research fellow for special operations and counterterrorism at the Heritage Foundation. He was also a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Dr. Bucci, please let us know what you think is important and actually relevant about Iran. Dr. Bucci, please.
Good day to all of you. It is my honor to address you. I wish you all a joyous Nowruz, and I am just happy to be here and pray that in the future we can do this in person, where I can see your wonderful faces and enjoy your company. Alireza has asked me to address what issues I think are relevant with regard to U.S.-Iranian relations, and I will do that. I can tell you, I don't think the challenges have changed. The challenges that we've had for a long time are still there, but unfortunately we are in a different context, which I believe will make the prospects for good Iranian-US relations very difficult and very dim, and also don't bode well for peace in the region. I will tell you, the American people and America in general is not the enemy of the Iranian people. Our problem is with the government of the mullahs and their thug-like enablers in the IRGC and the upper reaches of the military. We must address those problems, and we must address them effectively. Now, if you look back, President Obama, with respect, was deluded with many aspects of how he looked at our relationships with Iran. He thought he could negotiate with the mullahs, and it turned out he could not effectively. They basically took him to the cleaners, to use that expression. The mullahs realized that they could push him around, they could threaten, they could hold out, because he so badly wanted a deal that he was willing to give them anything they demanded. And they did make those demands, and he came through for them. He thought that we could get rid of the sanctions regime with no negative effects, that it would just, that the mullahs would basically just move over and begin playing nicely. And that was not what happened. When Trump came in, he badly tried to change that result. He tried to change the policies, and he had a great deal of success. He was able to move things back. He made an effort to get Iran to change. And the fact that it was working, that it was really starting to bite, is testified by the squawking and the complaining that Iran was making over the effects of the sanctions and how badly they wanted sanctions removed. Unfortunately, today, with President Biden, he seems to be set on returning to the failed policies of the Obama administration. And he's surrounded himself by many of the same intellectually crippled advisors that President Obama had. That's not going to work. Now, what do I think could work? What do I think the United States should do towards the Iranian government of the mullahs? I'll be happy to give you those recommendations, and add that I don't have any illusions that this particular administration is going to follow them. I'm very pessimistic about that, but we'll see. First and foremost, this government needs to stop the nonsense of the idea of returning to the fatally flawed JCPOA. That deal was a failure from the start. It was not working at any point during its implementation, and it's not going to work. It's a waste of time to try and get back into it. We need to recognize and label the government of the mullahs as the largest state sponsor of terror in the world, the most prevalent sponsor of that, and go after them for it. We also need to label them and pursue them as oppressors of the Iranian people. We have let them get away with running roughshod over their own population and basically given them a pass, or we have criticized other governments. That has to stop. We need to come together with the Iranian people against this government. And we need to forget the idea that the mullahs are ever going to be a partner for us in the Middle East in any meaningful or positive way until that government changes. All right, we need to return to the maximum pressure campaign that was in place during the last administration. And if for face-saving reasons, President Biden wants to call it something different, I'm fine with that, but he needs to do it. That has to happen because it was having a positive effect, and that's what we need to go back to. We need to follow a policy of containment against Iran at every step, every place the IRGC, the fundamental or equivalent of the Soviet Spetsnaz as assassins and spies and sponsors of terror. They need to be disputed everywhere they pop up. And we need to stop them and push them back with as much force as we need to end their malign influence. We need to continue to recruit a coalition of countries in the region who are like-minded and understand the threat that the mullahs pose, and use them to work with us to help push back against the mullahs at every step and at every place. And then we only can relent in this effort when the government actually changes itself. Not when they promise to, not when they say, well, we'll take this step if you take that step. When they change, that's the only time we can stop this process. Now, I will end with this. The people listening to me and listening to this event will play a role in the future of a truly free Iran. We must support you and we must help you in every way. There are many of us in America who promise we will continue to do that as long as it takes to see it bear fruit. I thank you, and I again wish you a joyous New Year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bucci, for your very, very comprehensive remarks. I think the way you ended it, that I fully agree that there are many, many Americans like you who promise that they will continue to help us as long as it takes to see it bear fruit, which is a free Iran. And last but not least, we'll hear from Mr. Bruce McComb, former Executive Director of Freedom House. He has followed the human rights situation in Iran for over 3 decades and done a lot of research and studies and publications about that, interviews with various people, both on the issue of human rights, but also on terrorism. Mr. McComb, please.
Happy Nowruz. This is an amazing time we can't share together. I would love to, and I'm sure everybody would. Please get vaccinated and mask up because of the pandemic. In the United States, the pandemic has taken more lives than all the wars of the 20th century combined. In Iran, over 250,000 people have died from the coronavirus. I love this celebration. I really wish we were together, and I really miss the food and the wonderful music that we used to have with real maestros, Iranian maestros coming in and playing for us. Let's look back in the last year that under the leadership of Mrs. Rajavi, the NCRI has grown considerably and deepened its relationships around the world. I see this in the new faces in the various seminars and press conferences that you have been holding. And I have to say that, you know, if you're 20 years younger than I am, you're still twice as old as the young people in the streets of Iran. That this revolution has gone on and this movement has grown so that it can't be denied anymore. In fact, I think we're seeing over the world that the international community has basically gotten fed up with the Iranian regime. Certainly the younger people have. That regime can offer them nothing. And the Iranian youth are just fed up, and I am too. We always say that next year in Tehran, when in the New Year's celebration, but in fact, the resistance isn't in Tehran, it's in every city in the country, and it will continue to grow. And we want to have a next year in Tehran so that we can celebrate Nowruz where it originated from. This year, we've seen the international community basically accept that the massacres in 1986 were crimes against humanity and are deserving of investigation and condemnation. We're also seeing that the assassination of Qasim Rajavi should be reinvestigated again after all these years. And then we saw the extraordinary situation where the Iranian terrorists were stripped of their legal immunity and sentenced to prison in Europe for trying to bomb all of us in Paris that past year. I miss Paris too. And I hope we can meet again before long on there. We have to say that there's so many concerns by various experts about whether, in fact, the EU would be weak on Iran, whether the United States would capitulate to Iran. But let's face it, the Biden administration's desire to get back in the nuclear deal was not great news for the Iranians, because the United States demanded they want to talk about the intercontinental missiles, the expansion of the nuclear program, the activities in the Middle East, and also the Iranian role in terrorism, which is not something that Iran wanted to hear at all. And all I can say is that when we think of this, that we're facing the situation now where, in fact, the NCRI has become the dominant figure in the issue of Iran. We can say in terms of the American culture that we had the cancer culture. Well, the NCRI canceled the Iranian regime culture. When have you last seen anyone apologize for that government? And all I can say is that the regime, though, continues to be very dangerous, and that its dangers from an intense weakness. It is extraordinarily weak at this moment in every thing, diplomatically, economically, militarily, every situation. The theoretical or theological empire really hasn't worked out very well. Iran is not in a good position, even in the region. So I think we can be hopeful that this new day, this new year, will bring us closer to what John Lewis had said to all of you, the great John Lewis, civil rights leader and a great friend of the NCRI, said that Iran will be free, and sooner rather than later. Thank you, and my friends, and I hope you have a great celebration. It is a wonderful celebration. It's my second favorite after American Thanksgiving. Hope to see you all soon when all this pandemic is over with. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce, for your relentless effort to shed the light on the lack of freedoms in Iran and always show the light at the end of the tunnel. You did an excellent summing up of all the activities in the past year. I like the phrase you used. You said the Iran regime is dangerous from intense weakness. And certainly that's exactly the case. And we hope, as you said, that free Iran will come very soon. Now, I'm pleased to share with you that our office has actually received several messages from the Iranian American youth who are inspired by the president-elect of the NCRI, Mrs. Rajavi, and her 10-point plan. Let's hear directly from the youth all across the United States. They have taped their messages, and we want to play their taped message. Please.
Hello, my name is Aaliyah Monfort-Trapp, and I'm currently a senior in high school. I will be attending college in the fall and majoring in international relations. My grandfather was killed by the Khomeini regime in 1988, and my mother, his daughter, has been a lifelong supporter of the NCRI. Naturally, I too am a supporter of the NCRI and of a free and democratic Iran. Ms. Maryam Rajavi's 10-point plan highlights so many important things for the future of Iran. What really stands out to me, though, is the emphasis on gender equality. As a minority woman having grown up in the US, I'm constantly reminded of the gender inequities that still exist in our society. But I can only imagine how much worse the situation is for women and girls living in Iran that are forced to live under the thumb of a fundamental and religious dictatorship. I fully support Ms. Maryam Rajavi's 10-point plan, and I hope to someday have the opportunity to visit my family's homeland.
Nowruz Mubarak to my compatriots, friends, and family. I wish us all strength through this new year as we are drawn closer in our journey to a free Iran. My name is Parsa Arya. I'm 19 years old. I'm from Houston, Texas, and currently in my second year of college, and I'm studying philosophy. Growing up in Texas, as well as being a supporter of the NCRI, has educated me on the importance of gender equality, private property, and a free market economy. Currently, in Iran, 95% of the top 500 companies are IRGC-linked, government-linked, or both. The lack of a free market economy in Iran has promoted suppression, corruption, and little to no social mobility. The people of Iran deserve a government that operates in their best interests. Yet they are subjected to a regime that robs them of their democratic rights in any way it can.
Salam. My name is Zoldan Ashgari. I live in Northeast Ohio, and I'm a recording artist and audio engineer who graduated from the Recording Arts and Technology program at Cuyahoga Community College. My family and I support the National Council of Resistance of Iran for a Free Iran, and I look forward to the day that I can visit its landscape firsthand and view its beautiful heritage. I myself have had the great pleasure of visiting Ashraf a couple times, and in spite of all the adversity and the hardships that the people of Ashraf have faced over the years, Ashrafis are among the kindest and most generous people I've ever had the pleasure of meeting in my life. Every day, I am grateful that I live in a country where my human rights are protected and that I can freely express myself how I choose. And I can only hope that in the very near future, we see an Iran where those same human rights are protected for the people of Iran. Until then, I offer my full support to the resistance, and I can only dream of the day where I can visit Iran and create music about its culture and about its people's passionate struggle for freedom. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mariam Hosseini, and I'm a senior in high school in California. I want to wish everyone a happy Nowruz, and I hope it's going to be a good year for all. From a young age, I've always participated in NCRI events, and I was first introduced to them by my parents. Growing up, I constantly heard the stories of the horrors of what was happening in Iran, and as I grew older, I decided that I want to fight for the freedom of the people of Iran and be their voice. Furthermore, the NCRI allows me with the opportunity to do this. When I educated myself about Mrs. Rajavi's 10-point plan, I realized how it is truly a complete proposal on how to achieve an ideal system for Iranians to live in. As a young girl, I was fascinated with the gender equality I see practiced in all ranks of resistance members. I find it inspiring to see so many women in leadership roles, specifically Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, and how she is the president-elect and leader of this organization. Furthermore, as the 10-point plan states, the separation of church and state is vital. I am fortunate enough to live in a country where freedom of religion and the separation of church and state is valued. However, under the regime's brutality, the mullahs do not allow freedom of religion, separation of church and state, and use religion to justify their horrible actions. These points give a vision of what a free Iran would be and an outline of what a free Iran would look like. They give a clear understanding of the future of Iran and what it will be. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Hadi Fahadi. I'm 16 years old and I'm in the 11th grade. I want to wish everybody a happy Nowruz. I know it's been a very difficult year, but Nowruz is always a time where we can enjoy our family's presence. I want to show my support for NCRI and Maryam Rajavi's 10-point plan. More specifically, this separation of church and state. When church and state go hand in hand, it results in a dictatorship where actions in benefit of the regime are of God and the opposite are of sin. This results in unfair legislation, trials, and punishment. As such, it was made one of the principal ideals of the American Constitution. This is why I stand with the NCRI. The people of Iran deserve freedom, justice, and fairness. Maryam Rajavi is the perfect fit for the job.
Happy Nowruz, everyone. My name is Tina Saidian. I was born and raised in Kansas, but I'm currently a student at UC Berkeley, where I study computer science and business administration. I was introduced to the National Council of Resistance from a young age, attending conferences and events across the United States and even in Paris with my family. And what really stood out to me was how genuine and passionate the resistance is about fostering change within Iran. I've had the opportunity over the years to witness firsthand people from all walks of life and from all different generations coming together to not only advocate for human rights and democracy, but to actually make the sacrifices necessary to turn their vision into a reality. And that's a level of determination and dedication that I really admire about the resistance. The NCRI thrives on a strong secular and democratic platform, which consists of basic principles like the freedom of expression and the rule of law, which we often take for granted in the United States. There are countless examples of young Iranians peacefully protesting for change, only to be shot dead in the streets or be put through kangaroo courts where they're ultimately sentenced to torture and execution for made-up charges. A couple of prominent examples of this include people like Navid Afkari, a champion wrestler who was recently executed last year for his involvement in anti-government protests. Another example is Ali Younesi, an award-winning student at Sharif University who has spent the last year in Evin prison because of his affiliations with the MEK. These are just two out of the thousands of examples of young Iranians who are persecuted on a daily basis for their beliefs. And this violates one of the most basic principles of human rights, the freedom of individuals to formulate and express dissenting opinions without fear of the government cracking down on their dissent. Likewise, any legitimate judicial system must operate on the presumption of innocence and the equal application of due process under the law. Because of this, I believe the bedrock of a free Iran will be built upon the principles of free expression and the rule of law, as all other facets of a democracy are going to be built upon these principles. Lastly, I want to send a message directly to the young Iranians who are fighting for change and acting as a real catalyst for change within the country. Your sacrifices are not in vain. We hear you and admire your courage. There is light at the end of the tunnel, and I look forward to a year of progress towards ending the mullah's reign of terror on Iran. Thank you, and Happy New Year.
Hello, my name is Hasti Esami. I graduated from the University of MD Anderson in Houston, and now I work in radiation field. I grew up in Iran, and growing up in Iran, as a kid, we were always taught through media and education system that being in war with other countries is a normal thing, and peace is never an option. We were forced in schools to say slogans like "Death to America" and "Death to Israel." And it was always our mentality that this is a normal thing and it's okay to be in war. But when I moved, especially to the United States a few years ago, my perception changed. And I learned that most countries live in peace and coexist with each other. That's why one of Maryam Rajavi's 10 points really resonated with me, the one that talks about regional and international peace. That's why I stand with Maryam Rajavi and I support her. Thank you.
Hello and Happy Nowruz to you. Today, I would like to talk about a 10-point plan which has been proposed by the President-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, Maryam Rajavi. My own interest in the 10-point plan comes from my background as an Iranian American and seeing the difference between how US mainstream media talks about the Iranian regime and my father and his family and friends' own experience who have lived in Iran. So let's talk about the 10-point plan. Number 1. In our view, the ballot box is the only criterion for legitimacy. This points to the fact that any great democratic nation has free and fair elections that represent the people at its backbone. Number 2, we want a pluralist system, freedom of parties and assembly, and we respect all individual freedoms. All great nations have diversity of thought. Number 3, we're committed to the abolition of the death penalty. This is a vital component because over the last 40 years, the Iranian regime has executed hundreds of thousands of Iranians, and in the summer of 1988 alone, they executed approximately 30,000 Iranians. Number 4, we're committed to the separation of religion and state. This is important because it points to the principle of secularism. Number 5, we believe in the complete gender equality in political, social, and economic arenas. We can see the commitment to this in the NCRI's leadership, which is largely female-driven, or in the fact that Maryam Rajavi is their leader, correct? Number 6, we believe in the rule of law and justice. All great democratic nations believe in the principle of law and order. Number 7, we're committed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and international conventions. The Iranian regime commits human rights abuses every day, and the NCRI would like to see an Iranian community and in Iran that respects the international community's rules and is a respected member themselves. Number 8, we recognize private property, private investment, and the market economy. The reality is that the IRGC has a hand in anywhere from 70 to 90% of the Iranian economy. Number 9, our foreign policy will be based on peaceful coexistence, international and regional peace and cooperation. This is completely juxtaposed to the Iranian regime, who has a hand in a lot of foreign proxy wars and foreign terrorism. Number 10, we want a non-nuclear Iran. And this points to the nuclear deal, right? And what so much of the conversation centers on, which is the Iranian regime's push for a nuclear weapon. Okay, so I'd like to thank you for taking time to hear out the 10-point plan. I hope you have a great Nowruz, and I hope this message sees you well. Let's help fight for a free Iran for the Iranian people. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was so heartwarming to see how Mrs. Rajavi's message of a free Iran actually resonates with so many young Iranian Americans, the youth here in America. My colleagues and I are really humbled by your message and your support. I want to thank all of them very much. But before I end, I was just told that some American students, young American students here in Washington, have prepared a very brief clip about what it means for them to see a free Iran. Let's watch that before we end the program.
A democratic Iran.
A democratic institution within Iran.
A democratic Iran.
A democratic Iran.
Truly democratic Iran.
A democratic Iran. To me, a democratic Iran means the freedom of choice in every facet of life.
Democratic Iran, to me, would signify that democracy and peace has hope and can prevail in the Middle East.
A democratic Iran would more than just stability and peace and the return of human rights to Iran.
A democratic Iran means hope and safety for the future.
Ultimately, a truly democratic Iran is foremost about the people who've been forced to bear the brunt of such an oppressive regime.
It holds the promise of more political involvement for women, stronger ties within the international community, and a political future free from religious interference. Better role in the international system.
It exemplifies that strong politics and honest governing can overcome any controversy between Sunni and Shia Muslims.
Iran could also lead the way for the democratization of its neighboring countries. Would bring stability to the Middle East in general and be a good sign of change for the Middle East, because Iran has such a high standing in the Middle East and can impact the countries around it.
And it'll also promote democracy and religious stability in the whole region for years to come.
As an 18-year-old, I think a democratic future for Iran means a better future for my generation, both in Iran and internationally.
A more free Iran, like the ideals that the NCRI is promoting, would completely alter the United States and the whole world's view of that entire country for generations to come, which I think is one of the most important impacts an organization could possibly have.
Stability,
hope,
safety,
freedom, and peace.
Certainly, you can see in a very short clip the impact of a free Iran and how the young Americans feel about it and see the impact of that. Before I close the event, I want to thank every single speakers who have joined us today and sharing the joy of Nowruz, but also their thoughts about the people of Iran, about the future. I want to thank every Iranian American who've joined us on Zoom from all over the United States, from almost all states throughout the country who have joined us and to share the celebration. And you know, I want to really say once again, wishing everyone a happy Nowruz and a prosperous New Year. Let me end this program with what Mrs. Rajavi said on the occasion of Nowruz about the fate of this regime. She said, and I quote, "Whatever happens in the future, The outcome awaiting the regime would be the outburst of uprising leading to its overthrow. They should know that with the JCPOA or without the JCPOA, with the sanctions or without the sanctions, the regime cannot escape the outbreak of the uprisings in Iran and its overthrow. End of quote. Indeed, a free Iran, as you just heard, is the only choice ahead of us. I want to thank you all very much, and God bless you all. Bye-bye.